Good morning. Welcome to today's webcast. My name is Josh Stevens. I'm the head geek here at SolarWinds. Today we're going to be talking about Orion NPM, and really a lot of the data today we'll cover all of the Orion family. But this is the part 2 customer training, or the more advanced level customer training session for Orion. As I mentioned, my name is Josh Stevens. A big howdy here from the SolarWinds headquarters in Austin. Today I have with me Chris LaPointe and Brandon Shop, two of our most esteemed product management team members, and really the two experts on Orion. Hello, guys.
How you doing, Josh?
Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing great, and thanks for helping us with this. I know that you guys are always anxious to talk to customers. You're super avidly available out there on Thwack, and I'd love to have you here in the office. Again, today's topic is going to be on Orion NPM, and it's really a customer training part 2. So if you're new to this, we did a part 1, a couple of different sessions, a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. And those sessions are available for viewing at solarwinds.com under support video tutorials. And you can go out there anytime and watch those and do it at your own pace. But today we're going to be doing a live session on Orion NPM. If you have any trouble with the session, this will be recorded, of course, and posted out there later. And for those of you who aren't familiar with SolarWinds, well, dude, you are on the wrong webcast. This is customer training. So we aren't going to try and sell you stuff today. This isn't about marketing. This is about giving you the real information you need to actually be able to manage your systems more effectively and get the advanced features that you're looking for. Some goals for today's training session. Number 1, we're going to talk about customizing reports. As many of you are aware, Orion has a pretty robust reporting capability. We ship the report writer utility to make it even easier to create and customize your own reports. We're going to go over that in detail and answer a lot of questions on that, I'm sure. We're going to actually talk about NMS failover and redundancy. We have some new offerings there. A lot of people are concerned about maintaining some fault tolerance in their network management systems in Orion. We're going to talk about how to do that. We're going to talk about how to tune the Orion polling engines and how to really make sure that they're keeping up with what you're trying to do. As a part of that, we'll talk about how to tell if they aren't keeping up and why you might want to get an Orion polling engine. We should really be sure and cover that. Next are maps and the Orion web console and alerts. And I will warn you now that if we're asking lots of questions and we're having great content, that is okay. It would not bother us a bit to get only through 2 of these 5 bullets, and then we schedule a part 3. I would rather we really cover the information and we answer questions than we just skim over it at a high level. So be sure to ask questions. We'll cover that as easily as we can, and we'll go over that. Now, I want to also mention we do have an advanced alerts webcast recorded and available at solarwinds.com, where all the other training sessions are. If you go to solarwinds.com, there are 2 areas that we store educational resources. First of all, if you click on the Geek Speak item at the top, you'll see recorded webcast, videos, Geeks guides, lots of information about the technology we support here at SolarWinds. If you're looking more specifically for training information, like the training session we're in right now, you want to be sure to go to Support, Video Tutorials, and then click the Training Sessions tab. And so as I mentioned, there is an advanced alerts training. It was a 90-minute session just on alerting. So if we don't get to that today, don't worry. You can go out and watch this anytime you like, and the data is still consistent with what we're going to be talking about today. So by the end of today's training session, you should be able to understand and actually implement report customization, to understand the Orion failover options and how to take advantage of those, to understand how to tune your polling engine and when to buy another one, when you need to understand when to upgrade, how to build and customize web and maps, and of course the alert manager if we can get to that. So a little bit about the Orion product family, because I want to be clear about what we are covering today. We're going to focus on Orion NPM, which is the main product in the Orion family. There are also products around traffic analysis and IPSLA management, network configuration management, IP address management, application performance monitoring, and storage and virtualization monitoring. And all of those things, for the most part, leverage the common Orion framework we're going to be talking about today for alerting, for reporting, for web customization. So it's pretty much all consistent. We also have, of course, the Orion polling engines for scalability, and those would be tuned pretty much the same way that you tune the main Orion engine. So this is all going to be applicable, but really today we're focused on the Orion Network Performance Monitor and as it relates to those 5 bullets. So with that, I'm going to try to hand over a lot of the content to Brandon and Chris. And the first thing we wanted to talk about today was report customization.
And so, as you can see here, there are 3 main components to creating and managing reports. So the first of which is the Orion Report Writer, which many of you are familiar with. That's the utility on the Orion server that you can go in and create new reports, edit, many of our out-of-the-box reports, cloning them, and if you want to tweak them or et cetera. So that's the utility that ships on the Orion server, and it supports the native report writer functionality. But you can also create what we called advanced SQL reports. So with the native GUI there, if there's a type of report that you can't create that you're looking to create, you can do that with just a straight SQL query. And so all this is stored in the backend SQL database, of course, which is what's storing and delivering the data, and that's what we're interfacing. So it's a direct interface to that SQL database. And so that those reports then can be run on the website and delivered via the Orion web server, so you can view those directly within the web. And then we'll talk about a couple other components here that will allow you to distribute them as well. So first of which is the Windows Event Scheduler. And so we leverage that technology to allow you to schedule reports. So if you want to schedule specific reports for your management to be delivered on a daily basis or weekly basis, you can schedule that with the Orion Report Scheduler utility that we ship with on the Orion server to schedule one or more reports on a periodic basis to be delivered. And as you can see on the last bullet, email provides the report delivery mechanism for when you do schedule them. So let me actually switch here with the mouse. All right, so next slide we'll go to here. Chris, you want to talk a little bit here about the architecture?
Sure, Brandon. So I think that you kind of covered it in terms of the key components. So this is just to walk through this diagram quickly. So the report writer will actually talk with our core services to actually interact with our scheduler. So we actually use the Windows task scheduler to set up schedule reports, and so that's how you get your reports via email, let's say on a weekly or a daily basis. As Brandon mentioned, you can write SQL reports directly against the SQL database, and we'll go into that a little bit later, as well as just create your own using the configuration utility, which is known as Report Writer.
And so a couple of questions here as we talk through here. So currently today, the Report Writer only runs on the local Orion server. So unlike Network Atlas, which you can load anywhere and connect to the Orion server remotely, the Report Writer itself is only accessible via the Orion server, so you need to RDP in to access it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you'll see, and you probably have seen if you've been with us for a while, is that more and more stuff is getting migrated into the website to allow for remote access. So node management was kind of the first piece. We're looking at other things. Report Writer will certainly be one of those.
All right. Chris, you want to cover the slide here?
Sure. So, I think, for those of you who have been playing with Orion for, as part of your implementation, I'm sure you've noticed all of the out-of-the-box reports. We have reports for almost everything that you can think of, so nodes, interface, events, inventory, CPU, memory, storage. And as you add more modules, one of the things you'll notice is that there'll be additional reports added to that interface. So as Brandon mentioned, there's really two ways to build new reports. So you can either go look at one of the examples that are already shipping out of the box, maybe edit it or clone it, and then select some different parameters. So if you wanted to change some of the columns or some of the formatting, you can do that. The other, if you have a DBA or you have some SQL expertise yourself, you can look at using the advanced SQL report. So that's actually writing a direct SQL query and returning those results in the format that you'd expect. Now, there are a number of examples out on our community site. So, if you're concerned about starting from scratch or you're not familiar with SQL, potentially you can take one of those that other customers have written and maybe just tweak it a little bit to get what you need.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of probably the most important tips that actually isn't on the slide, which is that one of the best ways to go out and get reports is from the community, from thwack.com.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So certainly you can use Report Writer to customize existing reports or create your own. And if you need something advanced, I'm a pretty SQL savvy guy. But even as many years as I've been working with SQL Server and writing T-Suite SQL scripts, I would much rather go to the THWAC and download someone else's report and customize that than start from scratch.
Exactly.
So be sure to keep that in mind. There are a lot of great reports out there, and there are a lot of experts out on THWAC that sort of sit out there and a lot of our MVPs, for instance, and kind of watch for opportunities to add value. So if you have a report you're having problems with, lob a request out the THWAC is a great place to get help.
Yeah, we've got a couple of comments here on the Q&A panel. Actually, a good tip here from Scott W. is you can also view the SQL code off basic alerts to give you an idea of how the alerts talk to SQL. So that might give you some insight in terms of the schema, what particular columns or attributes you might want to look at. There's another question from Wes VT, which is there a way to extract SQL query from a report writer that it uses for some of the default reports to use as a starting point? And yes, I mean, you can go look at if you go to the reports folder, you can actually view the actual queries that we're using to pull those reports.
Yeah, and we'll show you that here in just a second.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
What we're going to do is we're going to go through the slides until we hit the trivia question, and then we'll break away and get to the demo and kind of show what we're talking about.
So let's go ahead and jump here into the next slide here. So there are a few different report delivery options that we've kind of talked through already. Obviously, you have the Orion website that you can go and you can view all the reports that have been created, and even with the accounts, you can give specific reports to only certain users and not give them to other users. So you have control around that accessibility to reports. And you can also post a report as a resource in a view. So, if you have a no details view and you have specific a report you've already created and you want that to show as a resource within your standard no details view or any other view within Orion, if you go under, I believe it's under miscellaneous, I'll show it to you in the demo, but you can go ahead and add a report resource, and so it'll show up in your standard any standard view within Orion. And the second here is the automated email. So using the report scheduler utility that ships with Orion, you can go ahead and schedule a report writer report to be shipped in email to users or a set of users on a periodic basis as well.
Yeah, and Brandon, are we working on something around report scheduler in terms of different formatting?
Yep. So that's definitely a good point. So if you guys have looked on the product blog on the what we're working on for NPM, one of the things right now we're working on is the ability to both manually execute it from the website, but also schedule reports to be delivered via PDF. And so that is something to keep an eye out for here coming in the next version. All right, so let's jump into the first trivia question here. So the first 5 answers to get this correct will get a free SolarWinds t-shirt. So which report type allows you to edit the associated SQL query?
We do have a certification program here at SolarWinds, the SolarWinds Certified Professional Program, or SCP. And it's a great program to go out and get certified, improve your knowledge both of network management in general and best practices and on Orion. And definitely something you guys should think about if you're doing this as part of your career. It's a great option for you.
I think we've got plenty of answers here. Let's go ahead. So the answer is B, Advanced SQL Reports. So let me actually go into, I've already keyed into the Orion server, and under Alerting, Reporting, and Mapping, there's the Report Writer utility and the Orion Report Scheduler. So we'll open Report Writer here first. And so as you go in here, as you could see, all of the out-of-box reports that we've been talking about here are on the left that we ship. And so where these actually get stored, to Chris's point earlier about if you want to view the SQL query, is if you go to Program Files, SolarWinds, Orion, and then Reports. So all these reports that you see here on the left will match up to what you see within here. And so these are the actual report definitions. So if you download a report from THWAC, from the Content Exchange, this is where you'll place that report definition to show up within the report writer and within the Orion Web Console.
Now, Brandon, there's actually an easier way to see the SQL for these reports, right?
Yes, so this is just one of the methods. So the other method is if you go in and actually we'll select a report here. And so if you go in and actually view the report, you can see here that there's a multitude of different options here. But since we're talking specifically about SQL, when we come in here, we can go ahead and execute and preview the SQL query.
Yeah, what you do is you go up under report, and one of those options is show SQL, and then it'll add another tab to it.
Yep. So here's another way directly within Report Writer to view the SQL statement that is being executed. And as we said, this is kind of a good starting point if you want to take an existing report and go ahead and edit it and give you kind of something to start with instead of starting from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point, Brendan. So the screen that you see before you now is a read-only screen. You can't actually customize the SQL from here. So if you wanted to take this report and edit it, what you have to do is copy that SQL into a new report, and the new report must be of the advanced SQL type. Now, once you've done that, you can then edit the SQL script itself and begin to go from there. But you cannot edit the SQL within a report type that's not the advanced SQL report type. So keep that in mind when you're customizing it.
That's a good point.
You know, the other thing that I thought was interesting, and I tend to be a little scatterbrained, so I'm taking this off track, then slap me around a little bit, Brandon and Chris. But you know, when you're customizing the custom properties or doing account limitations, you know, at the end of when you save your custom properties, one of the things that you see it do right at the end is you see it say it's updating it, reporting alert schemas. Kind of flash on the screen just for a second. And I wanted to point that out right now because there are a set of schemas that actually build these reports. And if you look at the Select Fields tab on the report writer right there, the Select Fields, you know, the way that the schemas control what fields are available and how they're formatted on this screen. So this is one reason that you really want to leverage our built-in tools like the Custom Property Editor to add fields to your database versus going in and adding fields directly in SQL, because when we do that, we're doing a lot more than just manipulating the database behind the scenes.
Exactly. And so, you know, as we talked about here, you know, if you want to create a new report from scratch using the native report builder GUI, you can come in here and it's just as easy as adding a new field. So just like when you're building alerts, you come in here and specify specifically what field you're after, and then have the ability to sort it and any additional functions that you desire on it. So, you know, like we said, if there's additional reports that you can't support or that you can't accomplish with the native GUI, then what you'll do is you'll use the advanced SQL option within the report creation template. Some of the top things we hear is, I don't want a full report, I just want to see things like, show me the top 10 or the top 15 or a specific percentage of results. I don't, you know, maybe I have, you know, 500 nodes in my system and I don't want to see all 500 in a report. And so that's easy to do here. You could say show all records, show only the top 10, 15, or show a specific percentage. You can also specify, as Josh just mentioned, a time frame. So if you want to say for the last week or the last 24 hours for a relative time period, you can either do a named time period or a relative time period. So for example, last 24 hours is a very common type of report we want to see for 24 hours, for the last week, for the last month. And so you can easily change that here as well. And even if you want a specific time frame, if you're looking to isolate a problem or you need to report some data to your customers about a specific time frame for example, for interface utilization and bandwidth usage, you can go ahead and easily go pull that back out of the system based on using a specific time frame.
Yeah, I know a lot of people sometimes will want to run, for instance, their availability reports, and they want to block out, you know, windows, or maybe even make it only for business hours, you know, during the month. It's been a common request I've seen out there.
So also within here, you know, there's lots of customization that you can do around, you know, field formatting and grouping. If you want to do some grouping of this for more advanced formatting and customization, you know, that's all available within here as well. You can execute the SQL query to view it inline to the report designer, or you can go ahead and just view what the actual report will look like to your users when you deliver it to them via email or the various mechanisms that are available. And this is what they'll see with the header, and as you set up the customizations, this is what the end users will see.
You can export these from here too, right?
Yeah, and Brandon, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was the report resource,
Hmm.
and I wanted to make sure that we covered that because it's easy to miss because it's in sort of the miscellaneous bucket on resources, but it comes up quite a bit where customers, like the charts and graphs, and but we just want to put some table-based data for that particular node, and want that to be available on their views for folks within their NOC or potentially within the various department that's responsible for viewing that particular information.
So I'll select here the node details view and choose to add a new resource.
Yeah, and while this is coming up, one of the things that just to understand about because we covered views and resources in the last webinar that we did, is that for most of the resources that we provide, there's the ability to actually add a SQL query. So as you add it, maybe you could talk to that, Brandon, in terms of how you might use that to make this relevant to the page that you're showing it on.
Exactly, and so there's a couple different ways to do that. So first of all, the initial resource that Chris was talking about is under Report Writer, and it's called a report from Orion Report Writer. And so you'll select that resource, and when you go, and for example here, if we go in and preview, you'll get an empty dialog in that resource to go ahead and specify the report that you want to show here. And so when you go ahead and do that, you'll have the ability to change, obviously, the title, the subtitle, and you can even filter it with Advanced SQL, which is what Chris was, I believe, was just referencing to. But here, specifically, if we want to look at, report for availability for the last month, I can put that in here, and I can even filter that down even further based upon, if this is for a specific node or a specific set of nodes. But in essence, what that'll look like here when I submit it is then, not normally getting this error, but you'll see the report that shows up in line as a resource within there, so that way they don't have to run that report. They can view it, and then even when you're using the report scheduler, if you send that page as an HTML page to the user's email, they'll have the report embedded with the graphical charts and gauges, etc., within the web viewer, within the report that you email to a user.
Yeah. So in this way, I mean, essentially what you're doing is you're creating a resource. So, with Advanced SQL and with the default reports we provide, I mean, essentially it provides you sort of the ultimate flexibility to not only create the reports that you might want to schedule on a daily or weekly basis, but also to use this particular resource to add whatever data you want to the particular pages. And just to touch on the filter node SQL there, so one of the things to understand is that, because we're placing this on a node details page, we'd want this particular report to be relevant to that node. And so there's some things that you can do here where you'd want to do node equals the node variable. And what that does is when it actually pulls the report, it'll filter it to the specific node that you're looking at. And so you'd want to take that same approach if you're putting on an interface details page, unless of course you wanted to see data for all nodes. But in most cases, people when they go down and drill on node details, they're interested in specifically the data relevant to that node.
Now, what we're trying to do today is we're going to give each of the top 4 topics about 30 minutes or so each, and then have to move on. Now, we've talked about actually scheduling follow-on training classes for each of these topics, so a more advanced and deeper version of reporting, a more advanced class on web customization and alerting, and polling and failovers. So if you're interested in those, please let us know by either submitting a question over the Q&A panel or just email me at headgeek@solarwinds.com. I'd love to have that feedback so we know what to do next. There were a couple other things I wanted to talk about before we move on from reports, though. Number one, because I like kind of showing off this cool thing, is if you bring up one of the reports on the website and just run any one of the reports. Now, typically people will go in and run reports from Report Writer when they want to export them to a spreadsheet or a PDF or XML. You can actually do that right from here by just going to the URL and adding and the ampersand sign, data format equals, and just do Excel as an example. and it will actually pull the data from that report back in Excel. You can do the same thing with XML format. Keep that in mind as just sort of a quick shortcut you can use. The other thing that I wanted to be sure that we talked about here with regards to reporting is a lot of people that are out there have asked us about the differences in running reports live versus saving them. And if you go to the report writer, what you'll notice is that you're not actually running reports, you're building a query. You're building the report structure. So when you think about reports, typically reports to people are results, the results of a query. But for us in Report Writer, what you're actually building is not the result set, but the query. And I want to point this out because if you go run a report that says, show me my detailed metrics for last month, and you run that on the first day of the next month, say on October 1st, you run that for September, and you print off those reports, and you come back a month or two later and rerun that same report for September, the results will be slightly different because you have to remember that in the background we are continuing to summarize and roll up data all the time within the Orion database. So if you have a need to provide, for instance, monthly metric reports, you want to run those reports, you want to export them, you want to print them, keep them in a binder on your desk, and keep the results available, not just the actual report itself.
Yeah, good point here. And kind of the last thing I wanted to hit on here is one of the common things I hear from some users too is they want to have, as I mentioned earlier, specific reports for specific users to only show up on the website. And how do you go about accomplishing that? And so we showed you the directory here where all the reports are stored. And so if, let's say here you want to only show these 2 reports to a specific user, what you'll do here is you'll come back and copy those reports and actually come back here and create a new folder for management reports or power users reports. And then when you go into the specific accounts for those users, so if we go back here to settings, account manager, and let's edit Chris's account here. And so within this specific account, instead of specifying here the report folder, he has no reports, so instead of specifying /reports, when you create that new folder with the reports that you want to include in there, you'll specify that report, and then when they go to to their reports view for their account, they'll only see those specific reports that you've given them access to. So that's how you can restrict down what reports they can or can't see within the Orion Web Console. So that's another trick here if you're not familiar with that and how to go about accomplishing that. So as Josh mentioned, if you guys are more interested in going even further in depth in reports, please let us know via the chat Q&A panel, and we can look to have a more dedicated class going even further into reports. So the second point we want to talk about here is something that's a little near and dear to my heart. So this is about specifically, for your Orion, for performance and fault monitoring, you want to have high availability and disaster recovery. So this, you should always have monitoring, continuing of monitoring the business. So if a server has a hard drive failure, or you have a power failure, or let's say God forbid that your data center gets hit by a tornado and gets destroyed, you want to be able to maintain monitoring of your critical business and network infrastructure. And how do you go about doing that with Orion? And so what we are doing is we're releasing a new, what we're calling the Orion failover engine. And this is specifically designed exactly for this type of scenario. So it'll cover both high availability and disaster recovery, meaning high availability within the same LAN, or disaster recovery if you want to failover across the WAN. And so here are some key features here about this new product. So it'll cover both Orion and the modules, including the polars and EOC, the Enterprise Operations Console. And so it's capable of detecting not just problems with the Orion application, but it's also monitoring things like IIS, the web server. It's looking at key critical statistics on the server itself for disk usage and memory and CPU, and so you can go ahead and build some kind of automatic healing capabilities into the application and into the failover capabilities, which I'll walk through in the demo. And as I mentioned, it's available for Orion NPM and all of the modules. And the way this works is the failover server typically it'll assume the full identity and functionality of the failed server, including the IP address. So if you have NetFlow traffic analysis or syslog and traps being sent to the Orion server, you don't have to go and update all those devices to point to a new location. It'll assume the full identity of the primary server. It's a fast transition, so it'll fail over within a couple minutes, and you have a set of notifications that are built into it. It has its own independent alerting engine
Hey Brandon,
outside of Orion.
How does the failover server actually assume the identity, including the IP address and names? I know that you can't have two servers with the same IP address on the network at the same time. So can you explain a little bit how that works?
Yeah, that's a good point. So what it'll do there is kind of the way the setup process works is you install Orion on the primary server, get that running, and installing the failover engine software. It doesn't matter if it's a physical to physical box or physical to virtual or virtual to virtual. It'll take a clone of the primary Orion box, so that includes all the Active Directory parameters, the GUIDs, etc. of the primary server, and you then restore that back to the secondary server. So all those unique parameters, and then what it'll do is it has a packet filter that it'll put on the secondary's NIC. So even though they have the same IP address, it's still connected to the network, but it's not receiving or broadcasting out traffic to the network. So that way, when a failover scenario does occur, it'll pull that packet filter off that secondary NIC, and then, since you can only, as Chris mentioned, have one IP on the network at the same time, since the primary box is now down, the secondary can take off that packet filter and then start broadcasting and receiving traffic on the network with that IP address. And so, let's see here, just looking here. So, can you fail over everything except for the IP in case of a DR server is on a different subnet? And the answer to that is definitely for sure. Typically, in a DR scenario, you are going to be on a different subnet. And it can even be in a high availability scenario you are as well. So it doesn't have to use the identical IP. That's an option that you can choose based on what makes the most sense within your network infrastructure. But just beware that obviously if you fail over to another IP, it will update DNS in real time to point to the new IP. But if you have any NetFlow or syslog that's pointing to the primary's IP address, those will need to be updated. So, let's actually, kind of jump over here to the next slide, and talk more about this graphically. I think this will help out some. So, as you see here in this graphic, there's two servers here, the primary and the active and the passive. And so these are both connected to the network. And as you see here, they have the same IP address, but as you can see here, this packet filter is blocking broadcasting information out to the network. So it has the system has the same IP, but it's not broadcasting or receiving traffic. And so in between the two servers, we have a private channel that you need to set up that will allow Orion to do real-time replication back and forth and allow it to do the heartbeat checking of what's going on with the server. And so let's say, for example, we just got done talking about reports. So you add a new report, and you always want that to be up to date and replicated over to the secondary without having to manually copy it. What this will do is it'll go ahead and in real time, as any file changes, we have a set of file filters where we're watching specific directories, and if those files change, we'll replicate those over to the secondary server. So that server will always be, relatively, up to date with the primary server. So when it does fail over, all the data is intact and there. And so, kind of walking here into the next slide, as I mentioned, this will cover, it's a one-to-one mapping. So it'll cover the primary Orion server, including all the modules, and you can choose to have it cover the polling engine as well. So it's watching each of these systems that you have set up. And then you have SQL on the back end. And so this solution that we're offering here does not cover SQL. We do have some recommendations we can make to you if you don't have a SQL replication technology in place. And that's something that your sales team can recommend, or if you email Josh or myself, that we can give you more information on. in regards to SQL replication. So kind of quickly in a side-by-side here, today we have the hot standby engine, which we sell, and how does that differ from this? And so as you can see here, the hot standby engine covers high availability scenarios, specifically around the pollers. It doesn't watch services. So it's not watching the modules. It doesn't cover EOC. It's not watching IIS. It doesn't do real-time replication. So there are a lot of benefits here to the failover engine above and beyond what the existing hot standby engine does today. And so I think here, just quickly, it's available immediately. If you want more information on this or a more in-depth demo than we'll go through today, please contact your sales rep. And as I mentioned, there's also, we can recommend a SQL failover solution as well, which is available from the organization we're licensing this technology from. This is the same technology actually that VMware uses for its high availability and disaster recovery. So this is a very robust, tried and true technology. It's not a 1.0 type product. It's actually technology is pretty mature. So I think it makes sense here. Well, let's do a question and then we'll jump out into a demo and answer some questions. So which failure type will the Orion failover engine detect? And so answer on your Q&A panel. All right, and I think we've got all the answers here. So the answer is D, all the above. And so it's going to watch the Orion server, IIS, and polling engines. So let's hear just real quickly before we jump off into a demo. Let's actually go up here and...
Brandon, while you're searching through those, I wanted to mention that we did just set the subject and the calendar for the next training class. The next training class will be September 2nd, and it's actually going to be a much deeper training class on reporting. So in that class, we're going to cover a deeper setup and a more detailed how-to on reports, how to customize, how to build them, best practices, and we're going to specifically cover reporting not just on NPM, but on NPM, APM, NetFlow, and the NCM products. So we're going to do that on September 2nd. We'll send an email out to everybody. But if you're still feeling like we only give you an appetizer portion of alerts today and you're hungry for more, that's going to be coming towards you in about 3 weeks.
So a question here, from Robert P. is for failover, do your licenses have to be the same on both sides? What if you're using an NCM DL1000 at one site and an NCM DLX license at the DR site? Will this work, or will the licenses need to be the same? And the answer to that is the licenses need to be the same. So since the secondary box is in essence a clone, you don't have to purchase, let's say you have an SL2000 and a DL1000. You don't have to go and purchase 2 copies of each of those to protect them. You purchase, an Orion SL2000 and a NCM DL1000, and then if you purchase an Orion failover engine for two primary products, what'll happen is when it does that procedure of the cloning, it'll go ahead and create the instance of Orion on the secondary server.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really, really important point to point out there, right? Is that you don't have to buy a second copy of Orion to put on the failover server. You only buy the failover engine and its applicable components, and that handles all of that for you. Now, that's, of course, if you're trying to set up a fault-tolerant system and what we're talking about today. Now, there would be some disaster recovery type scenarios where you may want to do that differently, but, in those cases, you're not talking about a hot standby or an automated failover. You're talking about really a DR site with manual procedures.
Exactly. And so a couple other questions here, because I know this is kind of new here. So, don't you have to have the software loaded on the failover server before loading the failover engine software? So not on the secondary server. So on the primary server, you load Orion and the modules, and you get that set up and running. And
Same way you do without failover.
Exactly. Right? And so then let's say you have your installation today and you want to set this up. So you already have Orion running. It's all good. So you purchase the failover engine package. You'll install that onto the primary Orion server, and as part of the process, it'll ask you, do you want to take a clone of this using the native embedded technology, or do you want to do a VMware clone if it's a VMware box? And so in that case, when it does that snapshot or that clone, it's going to grab Orion, all the appropriate files and directories, all the appropriate registry settings, licenses, etc. And it's going to, then when you install the failover engine software on the secondary box, it's going to ask you, is this the primary or the secondary box? And you're going to say secondary, and it's going to say, okay, give me the backup file that you created from the primary, and I'm going to restore it back to this box. And so that way, like I said, when the secondary box is going to be in essence a complete clone or duplicate of the primary box.
Yeah, I mean, a way to look at it would be that the failover engine just sort of mirrors what's on your primary server. I mean, it mirrors the IP address, it mirrors all the file system, it mirrors the processes. It's just a reflection of what's on that server, and it dynamically takes over. So it's a brand new concept. It's in some ways similar to how a cluster would work, but really it's a lot better from our perspective in terms of providing you with a seamless failover scenario for the entire Orion family of products.
Yeah, and a couple other quick questions, and I'll jump into a quick demo. So in my diagram that I showed, it did have a crossover cable, and that was for specifically the inner site. So if you have a data center with high availability setup, for private communication, we recommend kind of a crossover cable. However, if you do want to fail over across the WAN, obviously, unless you have a really, really, really long crossover cable, that's not going to work. So you can do that replication across the WAN. And so this technology actually does have some native built-in WAN compression built into it to obviously minimize the amount of replication going across. But so it can handle both instances. So the graph that I did show did have a crossover cable, but it can support going across the native network infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea was just to demonstrate that it is going to require some dedicated bandwidth between those two hosts to keep the file system replicated and up to date.
Exactly. And so another question here: is there an upgrade path from the hot standby to the failover engine? So the from a software standpoint, no, it's a completely different software package. From a if you own the hot standby engine today, contact your sales rep and they can work with you on that. But from like I said, from a software standpoint, it's a fresh install.
Yeah, well, and it's important to understand that with the hot standby situation, you did have to have a separate copy of Orion, that hot standby copy, and you don't have that here, so you are only setting up Orion the one time.
And so this, as I mentioned, this is available today. This is actually something we just recently released as of the past couple of days. So those of you that have the current version of Orion, you mentioned that you haven't seen this, and that's because it's brand new. So let's quickly jump into a demo, and hopefully this will handle a lot of the questions. If not, like I said, please contact your sales if you want a further deepen demo. But so this is the SolarWinds failover manager, and so if you have multiple servers that you're monitoring for failover or disaster recovery, you can have them defined in here. And this client can be loaded on the Orion server or on your local desktop. And as we drill into here, I can see the current status of my primary and secondary server, that everything looks good. It's replicating, all the applications are running. And it's kind of the key points here to point out, and why this is different is, as I mentioned, it's not just monitoring Orion, it's monitoring all the modules, but it's looking at each individual service for Orion, including IIS. And so within here, I can say for the job engine, on first failure, second failure, and third failure, what do I want to occur? So you can do some self-healing here of the application automatically without your intervening. So if this service fails, I can say, first time it happens, go ahead and try to restart the service. If it still is failing and it's not recovering properly, maybe there's some dependencies for this service on other services. So let's go ahead and restart the whole Orion application. And if still it's still failing, something's wrong, I need to go ahead and switch over and kick off the failover process to the secondary box. So,
and Brandon, when you say that, in my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that even though it's detecting a problem with one of the services, when it decides to fail over, it fails over the whole application.
Correct.
Right?
That is correct. That's a good point. So when you kick off a failover scenario, it's going to go ahead and actually move over monitoring from the primary to the secondary. So all services are going to fail over. Some other key things in here as well is the rules here. And so as I mentioned, this is not just monitoring the Orion server, but it's looking at key things like IIS. So is the website up and running? Is the response time on the website, if you see that the application's working, but maybe there's something going on where it's taking for an unacceptable amount to load the page, you can have it basically restart the IIS pool automatically, and sometimes that'll clear up the issue. It's looking at the disk. Are you running out of disk space? What's the disk queue length? What's the memory look like on the server? What's the processor look like? And so for each of these things, you can come in here and edit them to what your what your preference is and what you want to have happen when you basically violate this level. So do you want to log it? Do you want to do a failover, or do you want to restart the app? So even within here, within the rules, you can do some of the self-healing, self-diagnostics type capability. Under the data, as I mentioned here, this has real-time replication. So as files change, but also as if anything changes within the registry. Let's say you install a new Orion module, and so certain things need to be replicated over to the secondary, so it's protected on the secondary as well. Things like licensing information, or the appropriate files and directories for that new module. It'll automatically get picked up and synchronized over. And so if there are things that we've built this so we're replicating these things in real time based on, we're not going to push over like log files and stuff like that that are going to put unnecessary traffic on the WAN or on the LAN. But if there are things outside of what we are replicating that you want to replicate over, things like user directories or profiles, you can add inclusion or exclusion filters outside of this to handle additional requirements that you may have within your business. And kind of the last piece I'll hit on here is, as I mentioned, this has its own kind of built-in alerting engine outside of Orion. So if you want to, for anything around the failover engine, things like the channel, the application, the network, the replication, any of the internal type things in here, if you want them to alert you on red, yellow, green, you can have it send you an email, but also run a command as well outside of Orion. So, this is kind of a really big thing here. This is something that you guys out in the community have been asking for quite some time, and this is something that we've been working on to deliver, to you guys. So, as I mentioned, if let's kind of switch over here, gears to the third item. I think we're going to do a
let's do a quick intermission.
Quick
so,
break.
We'll give everyone about a 3-minute break to grab a fresh cup of coffee or whatever you need to do for about 3 minutes. And during that time, we'll launch 2 quick poll questions, and we'll be right back. Don't mark it that way.
Well, we say that's our second. We say backing up configurations, and then change detection is the second one.
Well, let me restate it.
All right, welcome back, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started here again. So hopefully you've got your coffee, Mountain Dew, whatever you need to keep going. Let me go ahead and close out this poll and get you guys seeing the screen here again. So next we're going to talk about tuning Orion polling. Specifically, how do you know if you're running into problems and when you need a new poller, those kinds of things. So, Brandon, this is one of the questions that I know we get a lot. I know support gets this a lot. So how do they know if their pollers need tuning?
So there's a couple different methods to be able to diagnose that. So the first of which is on the Orion server. It's normal to see during a polling cycle the CPU spike up for a short period of time and then level back out. If you're seeing it constantly stay, at a high CPU level, then that's something that's kind of a first key indicator that you'll want to dig into. Second here is gaps in data. If you're looking at some of your charts and you're seeing that within there's some gaps in data from one data point to the next, that's another key indicator. The web functions or the web console is definitely slowing down. The server is overworking itself, kind of to the first bullet point around the prolonged high CPU. So it's competing for resources to render and generate the web console pages, and that kind of coincides here with the next one. you see the website timeout or various functions timeout. And so kind of the best place, though, to go look is kind of, and we'll show this in a demo, is on the settings page on Orion 10 or admin on earlier versions. If you go to details, to the polling engines page, you'll see within there kind of a counter of SNMP and ICMP polling counters. And if you see it, you'll kind of see if where it's at within it. Updates in real time. And if you see it behind in a significant percentage, and we'll kind of talk more about that, then that's a really good key indicator that the polling is behind and may need to be looked at to be tuned further, or you may need to look to get additional polling engine.
Yeah, I mean, but one of the things that I think you should keep in mind as you're looking at all of these bullet points here is obviously the rate that we can actually store data is based upon the I/O channel that we have to the database, and so as you look at whether or not your polling engines are sort of keeping up and can store data as expected, and you're starting to see some of these warning signs, a place to look at if you're not close to the element limit is your database, right? Because those things are closely correlated. So if your database, I think we mentioned this in the last webinar, was to look at your disk queue length at the database side, and you can look at that using Windows perfmon. So just type perfmon on the command line, bring up the disk queue length counter on your SQL server, and check kind of what that's at. And I think rule of thumb is no more than 2 times the number of up spindles or disks that you actually have.
Can we actually bring that up and kind of show them while we're talking about this?
Sure, actually.
Because I think it's a really good point that even though you might have your polling engine tuned appropriately, you can only tune it so far, right? And when you've done that, there'll be one of 2 things that you have to do. Either A, you'll have an I/O issue on your database server, and you'll need to resolve that, or B, you'll need to add an additional polling engine to help keep up with that load. And the Orion polling engine, generally speaking, can poll about 1,000 elements a minute, which results in a number of about 8,000 elements total, but based upon default polling intervals. And so it's really important to understand that if you've got 12,000 interfaces and you're trying to poll them every 5 minutes, you're going to need a couple of polling engines. You can't tune it that far. And one of the key indicators is that you'll be looking at charts and graphs, and you'll start to see little gaps in your data where it's just not keeping up and the data looks inconsistent. Now, I will tell you, if you've got 5,000 or 6,000 elements and you're polling every 5 minutes, Orion can keep up with that on one server, but you will have to tune that engine to make it do that. It does not ship out of the box in a way that it will perform at that level. So it's really important that you understand this is something that you will need to do if you have a system that's monitoring that size of network. And the reason for that is we want to ship it to where it's it offers as little impact as possible to the system and the network out of the box. Because if you have a smaller network and you have a limited amount of bandwidth, we don't want to send a bunch of polls out, all at the same time. But if you do have a high-end network and a large infrastructure, then you need to tweak this a little bit.
Right, and so this is the page that Brandon was mentioning, where you can look at the specific stats that you're seeing around ICMP and SNMP, there's some general rules of thumb around what you should expect to see on here. Brandon, you want to talk to that a bit before we go back to the slides?
Yeah, and so there's a couple key data points here. This will show for if you do have additional pullers today, it's going to show you all the engines, but there's a couple key data points here. So first off is the element count. So like we say, typically based on default polling settings, 8,000 to 9,000 elements, or right in there. And so if you see yourself hitting about that number, then you may want to look at adding additional puller onto Orion. And then if you scroll a little bit down there, under the ICMP and the SNMP status polling index, the key one there to keep an eye on is the SNMP status and SNMP statistics polling indexes.
Yeah, and it's almost always the statistics that get you, because for every status poll that you do or data collection point, there are probably on average 15 statistics you have to collect.
Yep.
And even though by default we collect status every 2 minutes and statistics every 9, that's only about a 4-to-1 ratio. So Typically you're going to see this problem occur most whenever you. It's giving you fits there, is it, Chris?
Yeah, I'm highlighting, but it's not highlighting the way that I want it to.
Give you fits when you're trying to do, the balancing of this, and you'll see those gaps in that data. But I have seen situations where people have a high enough element count where the the status stuff isn't keeping up either.
Yeah. And so and as Chris was highlighting here, if you're seeing that, if it's a few behind, that's not necessarily a big deal. I mean, if you're 10, 20, 40, 50, elements behind in that count, it doesn't have to always be at 100%. But if you're seeing it off by, multiple percentage points or, you'll notice if it's a decent amount, then you need to look at your element count, what's your polling interval. If you've tweaked it to actually poll for statistics and status at a much more frequent interval, then you're going to get less, usage out of or less scale out of the puller. So you're not going to be able to handle 8,000-9,000 elements if you are pulling on a more frequent basis. You're going to need to, potentially look at moving to an additional puller sooner than later.
So on the screen, we actually see that the default max pulse per second setting is set, I believe, at 30.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that whenever Orion checks to see if it needs to pull anything out of the database, when it does that, it will realize there are a set of elements that are due to be pulled, and it will send out 30 requests at that instance in a bulk send. And it will check momentarily. It will check again, and it will look to see, if there are more, and it'll send out 30 more. And so what you can do is you can actually adjust this metric so that you can send out more requests simultaneously. And there's a separate metric that you can adjust that controls how many outstanding requests total that we'll allow before we move on. So let's go ahead and show them how to adjust these settings and talk about that. While Chris is bringing that up, I wanted to go ahead and mention that there's one other really important thing that people tend to forget to do when they tune their polling engines, and that is setting the SNMP and ICMP timeout values for the Orion polling server. And out of the box, I believe those are set to 120 seconds or milliseconds, which means for every polling request we send out, we will wait 2 minutes for it to time out before we try again. And in today's networks, that's a really, really long time. 120 milliseconds typically means you're polling, across the continent or over a VSAT link or something like that. So one of the best practices is to figure out what your worst case average response time is. And let's say that most of your response times are sub 10 milliseconds, but maybe you have some devices that are in a data center that's remote from you, and maybe they average 20 to 30 milliseconds. If your worst case average is about 30 milliseconds, then double that and make that your timeout values for that. And what that will do is it will allow Orion to consider some of those polls for devices that are down or unreachable as failing sooner, and continue polling and moving beyond that. So it's really an important part of tuning the engine.
And kind of another key thing here is, every now and then I'll talk to a customer and they'll be like, hey, Brandon, you told me if I leave it at default settings and I could pull about 8,000 elements, and I'm starting to see gaps in my data at 6,500 or 7,000 elements, and what gives? Why is it doing that? And so, and for those of you that have been with SolarWinds for quite some time, some key things to remember here is, there's the node, the interfaces, and the volumes that we're pulling, but as Orion has matured and as it has grown as a product, we're also pulling additional things like if you have energy-wise technology, if you have wireless controllers that we're pulling the thin APs and the clients off of those. If you have NetFlow and we're pulling CBQoS data. If you have all those various things, that's we're pulling more data, and so that's ultimately going to affect to a certain extent the puller and how much capacity you can get out of that puller.
Yeah, but I want to point out one thing there to make it crystal clear is when we say that you can pull 8,000 elements with an Orion, we don't say we can do it at default settings. We say we can do it with the default polling interval. And to pull those 8,000 elements, even without CBTOS and wireless and all that, you will have to adjust this max pulse per second setting. So nowhere are we trying to say that without changing any of these settings should we be able to do that. What we're saying is on an Orion server, you should be able to tweak it to pull 8,000 elements total at the default polling interval, but you will have to tweak it. Now, my bonus question for you guys would be if you bring back up the polling engine, the match polls per second thing. I don't know if you still have that launched in your RDP session or not. If not, then not a big deal. But you saw there was a GUI there, and it said the current settings were 30, and it had a slider. So, my question for you is, if I were a user, why wouldn't I just set these at the highest value and move on?
Well, I mean, that's the question back to you would be, well, do you care if your server is at 100% CPU all the time?
Yeah, or do you care if the network's overloaded with
traffic?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Or if you've got a really beefy device that requires thousands of requests, even that one say Nexus 5000, do you want to overload it all at one time with requests? And so there's a fine balance between between tuning it to send out as many as it needs to, but not sending out more at a time than you have to. And one of the other things to keep in mind is, SNMP is UDP-based traffic, and of course the availability stats for devices are ICMP-based traffic. And when you send a flood of UDP or ICMP-based traffic out of the network, those are the most likely two types to get dropped. Mm-hmm. And so you really want to meter that out to the best of your ability over time. That's really, really important that you do that. So just keep that in mind. And this is something that, a lot of times we'll work with customers in detail to help them tune this. But it's the kind of thing that you're trying to do. If you're really trying to stretch what Orion can do on a single server, you adjust these. And at some point, and in some networks it's at 5,000 elements, at some networks it's at 12, you will need to buy that additional polling engine. And so maybe we can actually talk a little bit about sort of what an additional polling engine does and what it looks like when you add it to Orion.
Yeah, I wanted to cover. I think Josh, that's a good segue. Before we jump into that, I just want to answer a couple questions that we got here. One from Scott H is, where's a timeout set? So I kind of navigated to that in the background while these guys were talking. So you can see here, they're on the Orion polling settings page. You'll actually see where you can set not only the ICMP timeout or our ping timeouts, but also SNMP. And if we're polling VMware, you can also set our ESX API timeouts. So all of this is configurable from here. And again, it's a matter of tweaking this to adjust to your particular environment and kind of the characteristics of your network. So another question from David M. Brandon, maybe you can answer this. Is 2185 out of 3046 bad for the SNMP status polling index?
It seems a little bit behind to me. I think it's something definitely I would recommend opening a support ticket with to have that be investigated.
But can I ask a question? So if you're looking at that screen there,
let me go back to that screen.
Yeah,
Josh,
because I think maybe I'm confused, Brandon. So maybe my confusion will mirror someone else's on the call, and we won't be wasting time. But so when I think of a metric that's like that, so it's 2/3 of the way through the polling cycle. I mean, as each polling cycle starts over, that number will start at 0 and climb up.
Yeah. So if it stays behind, though.
Yeah. So I think what you're looking for is if you never see that number get above that through a whole polling cycle, then you have a problem. But that index is going to start at 0 and climb all the way through that number and then loop back. And you may never actually look at it and see it actually at the top number. You may never see it at more than, say, 90% of that top number. What you're looking for is actually to see, though, is it never getting done with that? And so if you could actually imagine, a 9-minute polling window, the first minute hits and we start polling things, and next thing you know, 9 minutes have gone by and we're only 2/3 of the way through the devices. That's the problem you're trying to fix. Yeah. And so you have to understand that what you're looking at is a point in time.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And so, and one last thing here I'll bring up before we push on is, I've had some other customer calls where, we keep talking about here, 9-minute and 10-minute statistic polling and different status polling. And so I've come across some customers that say, hey, my network is, we have specific SLAs on, needing to know when nodes are down or there's issues going on. And so they'll go ahead and they'll change the global setting. And so in that instance, obviously, you're putting more, the polling cycles are on a much more frequent basis. And when I ask them about it, I'm like, okay, well, which devices are critical to poll? Is it all of them, or is it just specific, maybe core data center switches and servers and devices? And typically, more often than not, it's there are specific devices that are critical to pull at that much more higher and frequent interval. I have edge devices or office or satellite devices that can be pulled at a more irregular interval, and so you can change the setting globally, but you can also override that on a per device and a per interface level as well to pull specific devices and specific interfaces at a much more frequent level than you do for any other device and any other interface in the system. And that's real easy to do as well in the node management screen if you just edit that device or edit that node or set of nodes, and you can within there you can change the pulling interval for that specific element or set of elements instead of doing it to the entire system.
Right. So, let's talk a little bit about what the additional polar actually buys you. I know there were some questions about, how many polars can you run on a single machine, and so the polars need to be installed either on their own VM or their own physical machine. So it's only one polar per machine. But what it essentially buys you is that additional scalability. So typically, when we ask people, how many elements do they have on a network, obviously it's gonna the number of polars required is going to vary based upon how often they want to poll and those sorts of things. But just as a general best practice, we basically take the number of elements and we divide it by the 8,000 number, and that gives us the number of polars. So if they have 80,000 elements, then they're probably going to need 8 total polars. So the Orion server plus 7 additional. So what won't it do, Brandon? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
So the additional polar, some of the things it's not going to do is it's not going to, it's only going to handle the polling infrastructure. So it's not going to serve as like an additional web server. They can't navigate to the web on that polar to hit Orion, things along those lines. So it's just going to be responsible for, the polling, but also if you have syslog and trap traffic, it'll process that and handle that as well. So you're not sending all that syslog and trap traffic back to the Orion server.
Right. So one of the things to point out is that I'm not sure how many. I know we have a lot of MSP customers, but I think even for folks that maybe have overlapping IP addresses within their network, that's one of the other things that the additional polars allows you to handle. So within a single polar, you can't have overlapping IPs because there's no way for us to uniquely identify those particular nodes from one another. But with an additional polar, we essentially use the engine ID along with the node ID to determine unique devices. And so that's one of the cool things that additional polars allows you to do is to handle overlapping IPs. So for each set of overlapping IPs or overlapping subnets, you'll need an additional polar. So hopefully that's clear. And then adding modules to additional polars. So this is something that we get a fair amount of questions on because we've changed that with the new releases of the modules. So what you do if you need to install, for instance, a APM additional polar, or you need to install an IPSLA additional polar, you actually just run the IPSLA or APM installer on the Orion additional polar, and it automatically installs the appropriate bits. So there is no separate download or separate bits for
or
each
separate
additional
fee, right?
Yeah, exactly, or separate fee, and there's actually a blog post on that that we can probably show you here in just a little bit that explains exactly how that works. But essentially, you pay for the Orion additional polar, Orion NPM additional polar, but for all of the modules, it's essentially free. So that was a change that was made relatively recently, and all the customers that were looking at additional polars for the modules were pretty happy about that.
Can you go ahead, just real quickly, Chris,
Sure.
jump back to the screen that shows the number of elements so we can really point out kind of, if you're sitting out there right now and you're thinking, oh, maybe I need to go buy another polar, where is the element count that you're looking at?
Right, so here's the element count that you're looking at. Typically, as it relates to NPM, when we say elements, it's probably going to be interfaces as your high count, and that will be the the indicator. So that would be this count here. So if you have an SL1000, then you're probably good here. But as you get up to maybe 80% or 90% at license, so if you have SL1000, you're at 800 or 900 elements interfaces, then that would be the point to start talking with your sales rep and looking at upgrading.
Yeah, and so if you've got the SLX, when you get to say 80% of 8,000 in general, so when you get to about really you get to about 5,000 elements, I'd start thinking about another polar.
All right, so let's go back to the slides here, and let's finish off this. So were there any other points, Josh or Brandon, that you guys want to talk about around the polars? I think we covered most of it.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I wanted to mention is that when we talked about what affects the performance of a polar, right, it's really three things. It's the number of elements you're trying to pull, the frequency at which you're trying to pull them, and the latency across the network to collect that data. And those are three variables that don't necessarily have to be consistent across your entire network, right? So latency will vary based upon the device you're polling and its location in proximity to the Orion server. The number of devices you have, is a pretty static thing. But what people sometimes forget is that those polling intervals can be adjusted at a per element level. And that's one reason I say it's a good idea to start thinking about another polling engine when you get to about that 5,000 element level. Because in many situations, while you may poll the overall network at the default settings every 2 minutes for status and 9 minutes for statistics, you may have a data center migration project going on, and you may want to pull everything in that one data center every minute for the next 3 months to really get a good baseline and understand what's happening there. And so to pull it every 1 minute, that increases the polling load by about 7 or 8x on average. And so you need to understand that you can adjust those things on a per element or a per device level. If you're trying to stretch out Orion, what you might do is stretch out the polling interval to every 15 minutes for user ports on your switches. They're a little bit less important. And drop it down to a shorter interval for the trunk ports, for instance. But just keep those things in mind, because those numbers, we talked about them generally, but you need to actually action on them specifically.
Yeah, that makes sense, Josh. And so, I showed that screen, so hopefully you guys caught that. But if you go to node management, you can edit a node or an interface and actually set the specific ICMP or I guess with interfaces be SNMP timeout values and polling intervals there. So,
any other questions we need to answer before we move on? Because the next topic is maps and web.
Yeah, I think we're covered on questions for now. So let's go ahead and move on. So maps are a really powerful concept, and so we wanted to cover some of the key things there. Network Atlas is kind of your interface for creating that. We'll talk about creating submaps or nested maps. We'll talk about using variables. So Orion variables are definitely an important thing to understand. You can actually extend the variables that are accessible using custom properties. So we'll talk a little about that. Backgrounds. So whether it be a map of a picture of your data center, or a picture of a device. Those are some common use cases. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about setting map view limitations. So with that, let's go ahead and let's actually dive in. Let's get away from slides and get back into the desktop session here. And let's go ahead and bring up Network Atlas and talk a little about that.
Yeah, and while Chris is doing this, we mentioned this earlier, but the Network Atlas utility starting, those of you who have been with us for a while know MapMaker. Network Atlas is the next round of that, as the next generation, and this can be loaded on your individual laptop or desktop, and you can connect to the Orion server remotely, starting with Network Atlas. So keep that in mind as well.
I guess I'm not going to launch another poll, but maybe you guys could just answer me over the Q&A panel. But for anyone out there, I'd love to know what version of Orion you're currently running. So if you'll just send me that information via the Q&A panel or via chat, either one. That way we know if you're using Atlas or if you're using MapMaker. Great, awesome. I can pull that data out of the spreadsheet afterwards and really understand it, so thanks.
Okay, so Brandon, I know that Network Atlas is kind of your baby, so maybe I'll turn this over to you and let you run through some of the things. as I was mentioning, I think one of the key things to cover is nested maps.
Hmm.
If we do nothing else, that's one of the things that customers probably use most often.
Yeah, and so here, Chris has already built some maps out here. And so you can see here are the list of all the maps that we have created. Some may be single level, some may be multiple level. But let me go ahead and actually we'll walk through creating a nested map here. So I'm going to create a new map. And on this map, I'm going to go ahead and add, a couple nodes on there. And I'm going to save this as, just throw something random in there, Chris, please. All right, Texas devices. So I now have this new map called Texas devices. And so I want to associate that as a sub-level map to my top-level map. So within here, I can go ahead and drag that map onto the primary map, and you'll now see Texas devices, and that that submap has its own status. So you can see here, this is another map that has some devices in it that are down or in a warning state, and so each submap has its own status as well that rolls up and bubbles up each level through multiple maps. So if I go here to the third level map, there are a couple devices in there. And so when you then go to the web, so if I actually go to here real quickly, and I'll change this map just so you can see what it looks like in the web console here. So I'll go in here and edit and get rid of Chris's fancy map, and we'll go to top level map here. And so when I do this, you'll see the second level map that I created the second ago. And so when I drill down into that, then you'll see the associated set of devices on that second level map. And there's even a node child status roll up for a third level map that I can then drill down into. So you can have United States, Texas, Austin, and then down into the office.
Yeah, Brandon, one of the things that I've learned is, at least for me, turns out to be a best practice is, when you go to the website, you drill down, right? You drill down from the top all the way down. But when I'm building maps, I build up. So I always start with the deepest map, and I build upwards, because otherwise it's sort of counterintuitive to how you would need to actually build the maps and nest them. So that's something that can save you a lot of time if you think about it from the most detailed level upwards and kind of build them from that level. And then it can make it a little easier to build. Now, you may need to actually go to a whiteboard or something and plan it out from the top down, but when you go to actually build them, it'll save you some time to do it from the bottom up.
Yeah, that's a good point. And a lot of times what our customers will do is when they're designing that, obviously the white background is pretty sterile, so we'll want to put a background image. And so we ship with some images that are static images, and you can extend these and add your own. Maybe it's a Visio background map that you've created, or I've seen universities that'll take a map of the campus and put that as the background so they can drill down into each building. And so you can come in here and specify a static map, of North America, for example. And so the other cool thing, though, that you don't want to lose sight of, though, is we have a lot of things like on our online demo. We have a real-time network weather map, or I'm sorry, a real-time weather map. And so using the linked background, you can specify a URL. Weather.com, for example. You can go for the map, the North America. And there's actually another product blog post on this, and we could show you that towards the end of where to find those at. But you can specify the URL, and as long as the Orion server has access, obviously, to the web, it'll pull down the image from that website and use that as its background. So you can have, from weather.com, you can have the storms overlaid onto the map. And so that's something that customers love to do. Or maybe you have an internal website with all your network diagrams that you want to link to that you update. So that's something that's new within Network Atlas that for those of you that are running MapMaker versions that you'll want to be aware of. Some other things within here that you may not necessarily be aware of is if you go up here to kind of the start option here, there's a Network Atlas settings option here. And so when you go into here, there's some tweaking you can do around the connection settings. But things like the map defaults of percentage of objects required for a map to be up, you can tweak this. The node tree, you can change what the icons are here, for each of these, and the graphic styles that you have by default. So if you want to use a specific image by default, you can change this. Obviously you can change each one individually, but if you want to change our defaults, you can do that within here. But another thing I see commonly talking to customers is for specific maps, I want to have specific properties around that. And so what I did here is on this specific map, I right-click and selected Map Properties. And the key thing to point out in here is this piece right here, Override Account Limitations for this map. And so here you have a setting to allow all users to view all nodes on this map, regardless of the account limitation settings they have defined within their user account within Orion. Obviously, if they try to drill down to the node details page from a map, if they don't have access to it, they're going to get the dialog message saying you don't have access. But some users, specifically within the MSP environment, they want to remove nodes that users don't have permission to view, and so we'll actually hide those on the map. And so, this is a setting on a per map basis that you can customize for each of your users. And so this is a really important setting that kind of sometimes gets lost and people aren't aware of within the individual map settings. Kind of continuing to go through here, if you one of the things we did do with the latest version 10.0 is we updated our graphics library, so you can always import your own graphics for the elements here, or you could choose from our out-of-the-box elements. We've got these courtesy of Cisco.com, but if you want to specify instead of that item there, you can specify it's a 5500. And so for this guy, I can go ahead and change it, and then I obviously resize it. And so I can use those icons or bring in my own as well. Kind of the key thing here is, we have a lot of customers, and this goes back to some of Chris's points. You can add a label to a device. And so let's say, I want to change this label to display specific information about that device based on a custom property or SNMP location or SNMP contact.
What about like CPU load?
Or exactly, CPU load is actually a really good example as well. If you want to show interface utilization or CPU utilization, memory utilization, and you want to show that within a tooltip, there's actually, if I go here to, let's see, I think we have, I should be able to go to, type in solarwinds.com. And so if you actually go, it's in the documentation, but I always go here. I find this easier to find and use. Don't want to install that. So if you go under support and go to knowledge bases for NPM, and then if you type in here, Chris, Atlas variables. Sorry, there you go. And so when this comes back here, so here is a list of a lot of the variables that you can use. So things like for applications, because you can put apps onto maps with 9.5 and 10.0, so it's not just nodes, interface, and volumes, and I'll show that in a second. But things like interface variables or node variables, and so these are the format. That way it's not you don't have to, it's specific to each device. So you can create this variable and it'll automatically update. So IPSLA, so if we do node variables here, if I want to do CPU load, for example, on this guy. So I want to copy this here and go back to the map. And so within this, this dialog or this variable here, I want to go ahead and actually paste that in there. And so that looks like didn't paste. So it's basically $, and then curly bracket. Oh, there it is there. So just was slow. So as you can see here, this is the variable. And so if I actually save this top level map, and I go back to the web console, when I refresh, And so let me actually go ahead and edit this to change the scale. Let's put that down to 20 or something like that, 30. Actually, I'll just do this. This is easier. Or not. Let me actually do this instead. So within here, so I'll just drag this guy over here. Actually scale down here. So if I do another refresh here.
Yeah, and Brandon, this is typically the way that I look at maps as well. Is you know, it's kind of a trial and error thing as you kind of go through and.
Yeah, since we scaled it down pretty small, but when we changed the scale, it took a second to actually update in the cache. So let's actually turn it back up to like 60. And so this will take a second to clear the cache out. There we go. So within there, let's see, I may not have that, but basically in that label it'll show the appropriate value. So within there, so you can do that on a node level, on an interface level, and these same variables also apply to the tooltips. So if you actually in the maps, if you go and edit here and go to the advanced features map tooltips, so within here for applications, interfaces, nodes, you can actually take that same tooltip and paste that in here, and then as you hover over, so if I submit, and if I go back here to the map, and as you hover over the individual nodes in the web as well, you know, that's actually a submap, so that's why it's not working, it's because that's a submap. Let me actually do this real quickly. Sorry, user pilot error. So if I actually change this here and actually insert actually I'll change that there. Did I not copy it? There it is. Alright, so if I actually save that now and close that out, sorry about that.
Brandon, when you get to a good stop breaking point, I want to stop and answer a few questions.
Sure. And so you can see right there in the hover over, you see 14%. And so, and you can obviously you could put text in front of that saying CPU load is :14% and put that variable symbol. And so then it'll show then in the hover over pop-up. And so that'll work same for the labels and for the hover over tooltips as well. So like I said, here are all the available ones. And like if it's custom properties, do $ open curly bracket and the name of the custom property definition itself. So, you know, business underscore unit or my underscore location, and then close bracket, and you'll get your custom property variables there. So, so one other couple last things here I'll cover, and then we'll do a quick Q&A and cover some of the questions. Is you know, if you do want to download Network Atlas, you can download that from here to your local station. If you have maps that are taking potentially a longer time to load, because you have, let's say maybe you have lots of submaps or lots of elements on there, it'll, you know, obviously it'll display a little circular icon while it's rendering, but you can turn on this option to display the cache map while the new map is loading. This is a new feature in 10.0, and so that way you'll get a map there, and when the new map finishes rendering and compiling, it'll swap it out with the old map. So that's another thing to be aware of in 10 as well.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that you'd want to look at. You know, if you have a large number of elements on your map, and you're seeing that load time take a long time for the maps to come up as you're viewing those things within your NOC, that might be an option to look at.
You know, some other little things here. You know, I talk to customers a lot of times. They want to do specific sizings, or they want to change the XY coordinates. You can do by pixel level here, or you can drag them around, or use the cursor. You can do outline or layouts. Those are probably the big ones there. Obviously, you have the group bys here as well, so you can do by status, by custom property. I have one called Brandon's property, by vendor, so I can break it out here for all the nodes by vendor. and view them that way. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, I'd like to stop and answer a few questions, and then we'll spend the rest of our time actually going over some more detailed use cases for Network Atlas. But while we answer the questions audibly, let's go ahead and launch. We have 2 more polls I need to complete.
Okay.
So go ahead and let's go ahead and launch one of those. That one would be great, and launch that so people can kind of see that. Let's go ahead and answer some questions now real quickly, and then we'll spend the rest of our time. We're going to skip the demos, actually, and just focus on the training today, because there's a couple more use cases in Network Atlas I want to cover.
So the first one is, can Network Atlas be run on my laptop versus a remote desktop? The answer is definitely yes. And the user Scott actually had problems installing on Windows 7. So it should work running on Windows 7. If you had an issue, please open a support case. It could be, Windows 7 has some more stringent security permissions, so maybe there's some security permissions there. Let's see, is there a way to show bandwidth percentage on a particular link on the map? And so, yeah, using those variables, you can definitely do that. So if you actually, as I mentioned here, you can drag not just nodes, but also interfaces and apps on there. So actually, if you drag an interface onto the map, you can use the same variables to actually show the percentage utilization. So we're actually going to swap over real quickly to the next poll.
Yeah, one of the things that people always ask me about, and I don't know if you might have, I kind of looked away for a second to answer a couple emails about that I got regarding the webcast. But can you tell me about Connect Now?
Yeah, and that's actually a good question. That's one of the questions that was up on here. So Connect Now is a new feature that we released with NPM 10.0, and so it leverages our web-based network sonar that we brought to market in 9.5 to build out the topological database on the back end. And so what that's going to do is, as you can see here, I drag these on, and you can obviously come in here and draw, lines and connections between these elements. But let's say I have, I want to use topological information to go ahead and actually automatically.
You gotta close that.
Oh, actually, sorry, you can't see anything because I got to close the poll.
Yeah, and then share your thing again.
So,
just hit close.
Yeah, let me go ahead and close this poll, and then I'll show you what I'm doing. All right, so let's see. Should be seeing my screen now. Let me make sure here. All right. So within here, let's say, for example, I want to go ahead and I'm going to group by status here, and so I can get all my up nodes. So I'm going to go ahead and drag, all of my nodes here onto the map real quickly. And so you can see here I have,
By the way, the multi-drag and drop is pretty new as well. So
yeah.
For those of you that have been just concerned with that for a long time, like I have, that's pretty cool.
So you can see within here, I've dragged a bunch of nodes, and if I were to have to go here and separate all these out and connect them, that could be a little cumbersome. So leveraging the topology data that we're gathering via the discovery, you can either right-click and say Connect Now or hit this button up here. And what it's going to do is then, based on the topology data, it's going to draw connections in between those devices. And so you can see here, I'm going to go ahead and actually change the layout to make it look a little bit more user appealing. And so, if I actually, for these devices here that didn't have any connections, I'll get rid of those. But as you can see here, I can see all of my connections, and I'll actually scroll in so you can see it a little bit better. Let me just do the slider. That way too far. All right, so you can see in here I've automatically then drawn these connections, and I can go ahead and come in here and if I want to manipulate them further, and draw additional connections, or if I want to, move them around, I can do that as well. If I want to move this guy, for example, out, I can do that. But the key thing in here is that it's associating the interface information as well that we've gathered from the discovery. So if I go into, if I actually go into the link here, go to the properties, you'll see for here the two interfaces that were connected for these two elements based on the discovery. So for those of you that already have NPM and say, okay, well, I'm already monitoring devices in Orion and I don't want to have to re-add them or delete them and re-add them, you don't have to do that. What you do is, if you run, for example, a report in Excel format that has IP addresses or the system names, just basically take those, copy and paste them, and if you go to the web-based network sonar and do a bulk upload discovery, And then one of the additional new features in 10 is the ability to schedule these, so you can schedule them on a nightly basis every 2 a.m. or once a week. But with that list, then you'll basically copy and paste those in here, because those are the devices that you're already monitoring in Orion. And when that discovery completes, what you'll need to do is you'll just need to basically, even though the element's already in the system, just choose to import one element. So if I go in here and select edit, for example, oh, wrong one, sorry. So if I go in here and import all, if I select the profile now, import all results. And so it'll show you what we found, and it's basically going to say, hey, you know, we found the same things that we're already monitoring. If you don't have to select them all, just select one here, and it'll update the topology database. So if you go next, and it's not going to do anything, it's not going to change anything. It's just going to go here and say, hey, this thing already exists in the system. So if I actually go here and actually walk through that, you'll see what I'm talking about here. So it'll say this already exists in the database, so I'm going to skip it. So it doesn't change any of your polling settings, or doesn't delete history or anything like that. I've heard a lot of those questions. It just basically forces an update to the topology database. So obviously new customers. So new customers, obviously, if you use the network sonar, it'll start gathering it, and then you can schedule it going forward. But then Chris already made this nice handy-dandy map that I took away from him. But we'll go back to it, the topology map here. And obviously you can use these with the submaps and etc. But then you have these Connect Now automated connections within a topology map that you can then leverage and use going forward. So you can see here one that Chris has done previously. So that's kind of a quick 2-minute overview on Connect Now. There's some product blog posts out about that to discuss a little further. What protocols we're using to discover, etc. What other questions you have on that, Josh? I want to make sure I hit that.
Well, one of the things that we had in the slides, and one of our experts from THWAC actually helped create the content, was naming maps using variables. I don't even know what that is. So is that something we do? Or is it a typo?
That might be a new feature to me too, so
okay,
I'll have to check. So
it sounds pretty cool, and I thought, well, heck, if we can do that, I'd like to kind of see it.
Yeah, the naming of the maps, I don't know. The like I said, you can use the variables within the labels and hover over tooltips, and that might be what's referenced there.
All right, I wanted to be sure and cover that in case somebody asked a question. You talked about view limitations already and submaps. We're not going to cover customizing the Orion website or advanced alerts today. We actually did quite a bit of work on customizing the Orion website in Orion NPM Level 1 training. We went over that in detail. If that's something you're especially focused on, check out the video. If it doesn't offer enough for you, email me at headgeek@solarwinds.com. We'll do another webcast to go over it in more depth. And as I mentioned earlier, we covered the alerts already. One of the things that I don't think you mentioned is that you can actually put performance data from modules on the maps as well. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I've actually done for customers is to create between two sites multiple lines representing that link. And then what I would do is I would use each of those lines to represent a directional path from either A to B or B to A, since all WAN circuits are full duplex, and to represent IPSLA operations and their performance.
Yep.
And that's a good segue into sort of what the IPSLA manager can do for you. So if you maybe bring that up real quick. In most networks today, we've got users distributed to more places than we do network management systems. And while the NMS can sit in the middle and collect data outward, we really need to understand the network availability and response time and application responsiveness from the user's location on the network. Maybe not from their PC directly, but from that site at least. And in today's environment, because most of us have replaced our frame relay backbones with MPLS, our networks are fully meshed. We've got internet connections directly attached to remote sites, and they have their own VPN backbones. Their traffic, for the most part, doesn't route back through our home location. And even if it does, like let's say we have a data center with the Exchange server in it, we may not be able to predict the path it takes. And so what IPSLA allows you to do is to have the routers that are already distributed in all of those sites that you've already paid for and you're already using run tests for you to show you performance across the network. And if we click on the top 10 list, it's really easy to tell where we have operations occurring from all different locations in our enterprise, from Ottawa, from Tulsa. I can't really see all of them from here, from all the different locations across our WAN, even though the NMS is sitting in a data center in Denver. And so it's really important to understand performance of all the different application types from those sites. Now, a couple of the things that have prevented people from deploying IPSLA in the past is, number one, they just didn't understand it well. And we have a very detailed at solarwinds.com/geek webcast, tech talks, white papers, and geeks guides to IPSLA to help you come up to speed on it. The other thing that would hold people back is that they didn't want to take a chance on impacting their router's performance by turning on an ancillary function like IPSLA. And with today's technology, that really isn't much of a concern, so you can feel good about that. And last but not least, configuring IPSLA from a command line and using the data from a command line is really laborious and confusing and just hard to do. But Orion IPSLA Manager actually automates all that for you. The configuration, it rolls that out on the devices, and it pulls the data back into the console. And it makes it, of course, an integrated part of the Orion website like everything else we do. So I wanted to be sure that we mentioned that today specifically. I think we're pretty much out of time for today. I don't want to keep anybody from their lunch breaks. 2 hours is a long time to be on a webcast and try to stay awake. And I appreciate everyone out there who's attended. Chris and Brandon, thanks so much for being with us today and helping us with this. If we go ahead and jump back to the slide deck, there's a couple more slides. Number one, where to get more information. I don't expect you to remember this or write it down. We'll email you a copy of the slides after the end of the presentation. And our last slide, if we go ahead and advance to there, is, please feel free to go out to solarwinds.com and download a trial version of any of the pieces of Orion you don't have today. You can feel confident that if you have Orion NPM in your backbone and you install an eval of APM, it won't mess things up. And if you decide not to buy APM, you can uninstall the eval seamlessly, no big deal. You can always email me directly, headgeek@solarwinds.com. Follow me on Twitter at SW_headgeek. Follow my blog at geekblog.solarwinds.com or just solarwinds.com/geek. Last but not least, please always remember to renew your maintenance. There's nothing sadder for me than a customer calling, trying to get hold of a new feature that they've seen on Thwack and they love, but they can't download the new version because they didn't renew their maintenance. So maintenance is the easiest way to make sure you always have access to the latest features from us. We develop a lot of new features every single release, every single quarter, and it's the only way to make sure you get all those releases for free. Otherwise, you're stuck paying upgrade fees. So everyone, thank you very much for attending. You'll get an email from us, a follow-up with a link to the recorded version and to the slides. And we will catch you on September 2nd for a detailed webcast on reporting. That'll be, based on your feedback today and the poll questions, it'll be a 1 hour long detailed webcast on reporting in all parts of Orion. And we'll make it just a simple hour. We'll do it first thing in the morning to make everybody available. And I'm looking forward to doing that with everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.